By the time I reached this magnificent blooming field, the sky had become overcast and the weather had turned bad. And if we speak in terms of physics, a certain event occurred, the weather turned bad. There are two approaches you can take to how all of this is perceived. According to one approach, this event has always existed. And you might say that this is a kind of fatalism, but no, it's just a perspective on the issue. According to the other approach, the event happens on the fly and is constantly changing depending on surrounding factors. That's the very principle of causality. Or, to put it in the words of the Terminator, there is no fate but what we make for ourselves. Of course, that sounds wonderful, it's very interesting. And in science fiction, all of this is wrapped up beautifully and vividly. But how should we perceive the existence of events and their arrangement along the arrow of time? Today we're going to talk about an interesting paradox that you may have heard of, or maybe not. It's called, informally speaking, the Andromeda paradox. What is it about? Actually, it's very simple. You remember that light has a limited speed of propagation in space, even in a vacuum. Light doesn't travel faster than a certain speed. One could argue here and say that this isn't entirely settled either. But, one way or another, modern physics is based on this concept. Let's base our discussion on this concept as well. And if we consider that the speed of light is defined even for a vacuum and has a certain maximum value, then we can confidently state that if some event were to occur right now somewhere in the Andromeda galaxy, it is so far away that by the time the light reaches us, we would, let's say, be recording this event as something that happened in the past. This is logical. It follows from the arrangement of events along a certain segment of the path. This corresponds to the logic of the arrow of time. But despite all this, if we look at how these events are formed, we are faced with many questions. In other words, if we greatly simplify everything, it turns out that any event we observe now has already happened in the past. And here, various philosophical perceptions come into play regarding this question. Will this knowledge be scientific? Yes, it will. Will this knowledge be purely physical? No, it won't, because physics cannot properly perceive this, and therefore, it is a paradox. We can divide any segments of time into fragments, and every little event that we try to correlate with another event will in fact be happening at a different time. This means that if we take both hands right now like this, or any objects or anything at all, just imagine any example and start moving our hands like this, these hands will not move synchronously. No matter how hard we try, it may seem to us that it is synchronous, but in reality, due to the simplest physiological reasons, this is absolutely not the case. Everywhere we assume simultaneity, we will see that events are not actually simultaneous. And this is a very big problem. It creates the impression that all the events happening are as if recorded on film. Remember that old film you used to load into a camera? Maybe you never did that, maybe you've used digital cameras from the very beginning, but I remember very well how that process went. And each frame on the film had its own position. Now think back to what the first videos looked like. That little figure who would flip through everything like this in a notepad and perform some actions. Each frame was already drawn. All these moments already have their place on the timeline. And to some extent, this deprives us of the ability to say that we somehow influence the future. By this logic, the legendary Terminator is mistaken. However, if we go back to the Terminator and remember how everything happened there, that's actually how it turned out. In fact, in the third part, which I consider not very successful, it was actually stated that the Terminator knew all of this. He was just trying to, well, not so much convince us otherwise, but to change the situation for the better for the specific characters. So what does that mean then? Does that mean that fortune tellers who look into a crystal ball can really predict the future? Maybe this crystal ball is somehow able to transport us to that particular frame of space-time that actually exists? I suppose that if we still rely on physics, then this question is very vague. Physics does not directly prohibit the possibility of seeing events in the future or seeing events in the past. But it doesn't allow it either. Accordingly, physics also implies the principle of causality. And what is the principle of causality in physics? The data that will influence the picture in the future, if sufficient, directly determine the state of the system. This, in a greatly simplified form, is the principle of causality, fundamental principle of physics. If you recall, when Einstein learned about the logic of quantum entanglement, he was actually frightened by the fact that all the fundamental principles of physics seem to be collapsing. Not only is the maximum speed of light, which is still limited, excluded, but also the sequence of effect excused, the tautology following the cause, is excluded as well. The cause must necessarily always precede the effect. And that example with the cup is simpler than a weather forecast. In that case, the cause could have been, for example, that the cup was wet, the person didn't grip it firmly enough, and it slipped out of their hands. The cause is a decrease in friction. The effect, obviously, is that the cup is broken. In physical terms, the entropy of the system has increased, and the arrow of time relentlessly points in the direction of increasing entropy. And this, essentially, is where physics stops. And all the other hypotheses that we're discussing right now, all the other hypotheses that we're trying to sort out, they are just that hypotheses, and there is no direct physical solution to the Andromeda paradox. What interests us is that if such events do occur, then this information is stored some way, it is stored somehow. This means that essentially the Terminator was wrong. And if John Connor and the Terminator were wrong, then it turns out that all of physics consists of a sequence of frames in time. And it also turns out that these frames of time already exist. And this is the most interesting part, and to some extent even a little frightening. On the other hand, essentially, given that our ability to choose is limited, given that our perception of reality is limited, and we are beings accustomed to living in this continuum, for us, in fact, this has no fundamental significance. But if we learn how to punch a hole from one frame to another, then we could travel through time in much the same way as described in various works of science fiction. Of course, this is already a realm far removed from strictly scientific academic knowledge, but it is still interesting. Alright, if this is really the case, if all events have already happened, if everything is recorded on the arrow of time far ahead, if all of this is just frames on a film, then we need to understand, first of all, that we cannot really talk about the present moment, and secondly, the subjects existing within this system must somehow, perhaps choose, or whatever the right word is, the current moment in time. If what is happening right now is merely the focus of consciousness, then it is precisely this focus of consciousness that must somehow influence reality. Here, one can construct the most complex and most unpredictable theories, which could even be physical in nature. For example, one could say that if we manifest a particle from all possible states, then through our attention and concentration, we focus a specific material object out of energy, which we then perceive in our macro world. This can be applied relatively to all the states that we have. And then, simply by focusing our attention, we can say that we have chosen one event or another. And yes, I realize this is starting to sound a bit like transurfing. There is this, I'm not sure whether to call it a fantastical or non-fantastical, physical or non-physical concept, in which it seems that the observer themselves chooses the version of reality they are in. The most frustrating thing about all these theories and concepts is that it's very hard to argue with them. And the physicists can't just say, no, this doesn't exist, this contradicts physics. It's not that it contradicts physics, it's more that it hasn't been confirmed by physics.